What if a single act of kindness could change everything? He was just a poor mechanic, worn hands, quiet heart, living a simple life far from the noise of the world. When he answered a call to fix a broken kitchen sink in a mansion no one ever visited, he thought it was just another odd job. But the woman who opened the door wasn't just anyone. She was a billionaire bride on the edge of being forced into a loveless marriage. And she had a plan. What started as a fake marriage turned into something far more powerful, a story of second chances, healing, and a love that neither of them expected. Stay with us because this is a story that will warm your heart and remind you that sometimes the most extraordinary love begins in the most ordinary moments. Before we begin, if you enjoy heartwarming stories about love, kindness, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We share inspiring tales that speak to the soul, and we'd love to have you with us. Now let's begin. The call came in just after 3 on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Ethan Cole wiped the grease from his hands onto a faded red rag and set down his wrench. Outside, the October wind blew golden leaves across the cracked pavement in front of his auto repair shop. It had been a slow day, an oil change, a rusted muffler, nothing special. Nothing that stirred anything in him but the quiet satisfaction of honest work. The number on the caller ID was unfamiliar, unlisted. Ethan almost let it go to voicemail. But something nudged him. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just the silence pressing in too heavily. He picked up. "Cole's Auto," he said. There was a pause, then a voice, smooth, steady, female. "Hi, I was told you do some handyman work. Apart from cars." Ethan hesitated. "I do sometimes. Depends on what you need. My kitchen sink. It's leaking. Badly. I've tried calling 3 plumbers today. No one wants to come out this far." "How far is far?" he asked, grabbing a notepad. "I'm up on Red Maple Hill, the Beaumont estate." Ethan stopped scribbling. The Beaumont estate? The old brick mansion that loomed above town like a memory no one wanted to touch? It had been empty for years. A relic. People said it belonged to a New York billionaire heiress who never bothered to visit. But the voice on the phone didn't sound like a billionaire. She sounded young, polished, just slightly weary. He cleared his throat. "All right, I can be there in 40. The gate was already open when Ethan pulled his pickup truck up the winding drive. The mansion rose ahead, red brick glowing warm against the gray sky, its tall windows watching like quiet sentinels. Someone had been taking care of the grounds. That much was clear, though the house still wore the aura of distance, as if it was waiting for something to fill it again. Ethan grabbed his toolbox and knocked twice on the heavy oak door. It opened almost immediately. The woman standing there looked nothing like what he'd imagined. She wore a loose cashmere sweater and jeans, barefoot on the marble floor. Her hair was pulled into a low ponytail, and her face, bare, without makeup, held a softness that didn't match the intimidating weight of the mansion. "You must be Mr. Cole," she said. Her smile was brief but sincere. "I'm Lila." He nodded once. "Leaky sink?" She stepped aside and motioned toward the kitchen. "That's the one." The kitchen was something out of an architecture magazine. Marble counters, brass fixtures, a range that looked like it had never been used. But there it was, water pooling beneath the farmhouse sink, a steady drip, drip, drip echoing off the tiles. Ethan set to work, crawling under the sink without much fanfare. "Old pipes," he muttered. "Looks like someone tried to fix this with tape." "I tried," Lila said, and for the first time he heard a small note of embarrassment in her voice. He glanced at her from beneath the counter. "Not a bad attempt. Most folks wouldn't even try." She didn't answer, but when he emerged 10 minutes later, she was still standing there, watching him. "You're the first person who's come inside this house in a long time," she said quietly. "Besides the staff." Ethan wiped his hands again, now slightly damp. "Most people think it's empty." "It was," she said, "until recently." He didn't press. He wasn't the kind to ask questions people weren't ready to answer. Instead, he nodded toward the sink. "Try running it." She turned on the faucet. No leaks. "Just needed someone who knew what they were doing," she said, and smiled again. This time it stayed a little longer. He started packing up, but something tugged at him to linger. He glanced around. The kitchen, as stunning as it was, felt oddly unused. A bowl of apples sat on the counter, untouched. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and loneliness. "Your staff around?" he asked casually. "Gone for the day," she replied. That surprised him. "So you're here alone?" She nodded. "And completely unqualified to deal with plumbing disasters." He chuckled. "You're doing fine." There was another pause, but not the awkward kind. The kind that comes when two people are both searching for something to say that doesn't sound like too much or too little. "I could make you some coffee," she offered almost shyly, "if you're not in a rush." Ethan hesitated. He hadn't had a cup since morning, and something in her tone, something fragile but hopeful, made it hard to say no. "Sure," he said. She moved to the espresso machine, an expensive-looking contraption that clearly baffled her. "Mind if I—" He gestured toward it. She stepped aside with a sheepish look. "Be my guest." He turned a few knobs, pressed a button, and the machine came to life with a hum. "Impressive," she said. "Built my first engine at 16, he replied with a shrug. "Machines I can handle. And people." That caught him off guard. He looked up and she was watching him again, not boldly, but openly. "I guess that depends on the person," he said. Lila didn't answer, but something in her expression shifted, like a decision being formed just beneath the surface. The espresso steamed into 2 cups. He handed her one. "To the sink," he said. She raised her cup. "To people who still show up when no one else will." He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he took a sip of his coffee and let the silence settle again. Easy this time. Familiar. He left an hour later, with a lingering sense that he'd stepped into something larger than a simple repair job. What he didn't know, couldn't have guessed, was that the woman he had just fixed a sink for was no ordinary homeowner. And the next time he stepped through those doors, she would ask him to do something far more complicated than plumbing. She would ask him to be her husband. Ethan didn't return to the Beaumont estate for 3 days. Not because he didn't think about it. He did often. In the quiet moments between oil changes and brake inspections, his mind kept circling back to that kitchen, to the sound of water dripping into the sink, to the strange stillness of a mansion too grand to be lived in. And to her, Lila. There was something about the way she watched him, not with flirtation or curiosity, but with intent, like she was weighing something, judging not just what he was doing, but who he was. And though they had exchanged barely more than a few minutes of small talk and a cup of coffee, Ethan felt like he had been seen more clearly in that kitchen than he had in years. So when her number popped up again on his phone late Sunday morning, he answered before the second ring. "I was wondering," she said, her voice carefully composed, "if you had time to come by again. There's something I'd like to discuss. Not a repair this time." He frowned slightly. "Everything all right?" "Yes," she said, "but I think I need your help again. Just not with plumbing." That was enough to pique his interest. 20 minutes later, he was back in his truck, tires crunching over the gravel of the long circular driveway. The leaves had deepened to a more vivid gold since his last visit, and the mansion looked even more regal against the cloudless sky. But as the front door opened and Lila appeared, her expression was taut, composed but with something beneath the surface, something restrained. She led him not to the kitchen but to a sunroom that looked out over the sloping hills behind the estate. Autumn spilled across the landscape in layers of amber and fire. Lila motioned to a seat but didn't sit herself. "I'm going to ask you something," she began, "and I need you to hear me out before you say anything." Ethan's instincts stiffened. He wasn't easily rattled, but the seriousness in her tone was unmistakable. "Okay," he said slowly. "I'm listening." She drew a breath, then walked to the tall windows, arms crossed as if to shield herself from what she was about to say. "My family," she said carefully, "has arranged for me to marry the son of another family. A merger, more or less. A symbolic alliance between 2 empires." He blinked. "You mean, like an actual arranged marriage?" She gave a humorless smile. "It's not so uncommon in our world. Not forced per se, but heavily encouraged. The man they want me to marry, Charles Whitmore, is, on paper, a perfect match. But in reality, he's cruel, manipulative, and morally bankrupt. And I won't spend my life being traded like a business asset. Ethan remained quiet. The air between them thickened. I've tried to fight it, she continued, but I'm running out of time. My father has made it clear that unless I provide a legitimate, binding reason to stop the engagement, they'll proceed with it, no matter what I say. And where do I come in? Ethan asked, though part of him already knew. She turned to face him fully now. Her eyes were steady, but her hands trembled. I want to marry you, legally, publicly, a real marriage, on paper, not for love, not forever, just long enough to stop this from happening. The words landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. Ethan stared at her, trying to gauge whether this was a joke, but her face was dead serious. You barely know me, he said. I've watched you, she replied softly. Not just when you fixed the sink, the way you spoke to Maria, my housekeeper, the way you wiped your boots before walking in, the way you listened. You're steady, kind, honest, and I don't know many men in my world I could say that about. He shook his head slightly, stunned. This isn't just some stunt, Lila. Marriage is… Exactly, she cut in gently. That's why I'm asking you. Not because it's a game, but because I need someone who will take it seriously, even if it's temporary. Ethan stood, moving to the window beside her. He stared out at the trees. Part of him wanted to walk away right then. This wasn't his life. This was something out of a movie. Arranged marriages, corporate dynasties, false unions. He was a mechanic, for heaven's sake. Not a pawn in some billionaire chess game. But then he glanced at her, and what he saw wasn't a powerful heiress demanding a favor. It was a young woman, trapped, brave enough to ask for help, yet vulnerable enough to still be terrified of what his answer might be. He exhaled slowly. If I say yes, he said, what happens next? We file for a marriage license, make a public announcement, attend one or two events together. It doesn't have to be romantic, just believable. And your family? They'll hate it, which is exactly the point. He gave a short laugh. You sure know how to sell it. Her smile flickered. I can compensate you, of course. No, he said firmly, turning to face her. Don't offer me money. If I do this, it's not because of that. She looked at him, really looked, and something in her gaze softened. Then why would you do it? He thought for a long moment. And then quietly he said, because I've seen what it's like when someone's life is taken away from them, when they're cornered by people who only see what they want, and I've spent too many years staying out of things that matter. Maybe it's time I show up. Lila didn't say anything at first. Then she nodded slowly. There was something almost reverent in the way she reached for his hand, not to shake it, not to seal a deal, but to hold it, grateful, grounded. You just gave me my life back, she whispered. He didn't answer. He just let her hold his hand a moment longer, both of them standing there, strangers bound not by love, not yet, but by something deeper, trust. And that sometimes is where the most unexpected love begins. The town clerk blinked when Lila Beaumont walked through the door with Ethan Cole at her side. To be fair, it wasn't every day that a local mechanic strolled into the municipal building with the most mysterious woman in Fairfield County, the elusive Beaumont heiress, dressed in a cashmere coat and suede ankle boots, hair swept into a low chignon like she'd stepped off the pages of a lifestyle magazine. Marriage license, she said calmly, laying her driver's license and birth certificate on the counter. The clerk, a round woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the skepticism of someone who'd lived through 2 divorces, narrowed her gaze. Together? She asked. Lila nodded. Ethan just smiled politely, trying not to look like a man who still couldn't believe where he was standing. The process itself was quick. No fanfare, no confetti, just signatures on a government-issued form, an awkward moment when Ethan had to state never married, and a final nod from the clerk as she slid the papers into a tray marked pending review. You've got 48 hours before it's official, the clerk said, glancing between them. After that, well, you're stuck with each other, at least on paper. Thank you, Lila said, the corners of her mouth lifting slightly. We'll make it work. Back outside, the wind had picked up, scattering leaves across the courthouse steps. Lila walked ahead, her heels clicking lightly against the stone. Ethan followed, still not sure what expression to wear. Relief? Curiosity? Mild panic? She stopped by the passenger door of his truck and looked at him. You okay? He rubbed the back of his neck. Honestly, I feel like I just signed up for a role in a play where I don't know the lines yet. Her smile deepened. That's fair, but you're doing great. They drove in silence for a few minutes, the town shrinking in the rearview mirror. Ethan kept his hands steady on the wheel, though his thoughts were anything but. He wasn't impulsive by nature. He liked things that made sense. Engines, blueprints, systems that followed logic. This, whatever this was, defied every rule he lived by. And yet, here he was. Back at the estate, the mood shifted. The housekeeper, Maria, blinked hard when she saw them walk in with a marriage license envelope in Lila's hand. Lila offered no explanation. She simply asked Maria to have a guest room prepared for Ethan, on the west side near the greenhouse. Ethan had expected to sleep in the garage. The room was large, quiet, and elegant in a masculine way. Navy tones, dark oak, and a view of the lake behind the estate. As he dropped his bag beside the dresser, Ethan caught sight of himself in the mirror. A mechanic's face, slight stubble, tired eyes, a jaw set too tightly. The reflection of a man who had once ruled boardrooms, now playing husband to a woman from a world he no longer wanted anything to do with. He didn't know what game fate was playing, but he wasn't entirely convinced he'd won. Dinner that evening was quiet. Lila didn't offer much conversation, and Ethan didn't push. They sat at opposite ends of a long walnut table that could have easily seated 10. The silverware glinted in candlelight. The roasted chicken tasted like heaven, and yet the silence between them was thick. Tomorrow, Lila finally said, we'll need to announce it. Ethan looked up. To who? My family, then the press, and then, well, everyone. He raised an eyebrow. You sure you want to go that big, that fast? She nodded. It has to feel real, convincing. A quiet marriage won't stop them, but a bold one, unapologetic, completely outside their control, might. All right, he said, but I need to ask, what happens after? Lila set her fork down. Her expression softened. After we've done enough damage to make the Whitmores back off, and my father realizes he can't control me anymore, we file for divorce. Quietly, no drama. I'll take care of everything legally. Ethan nodded slowly. And until then, we play house? Something like that. He considered her a moment. You know, for a fake marriage, you seem awfully good at this. She smiled, not smugly, but sadly. That's the thing, Ethan. I've been pretending to be someone else for most of my life. Pretending I was okay with expectations, with being the perfect daughter, the perfect trophy. This is the first time I've chosen something for myself, even if it's pretend. Ethan's jaw eased a little. Well, if we're pretending, we should probably get our story straight. Like how we met, where we fell in love, first kiss. Lila chuckled, the first genuine laugh he'd heard from her. You're right. We'll need a whole backstory. Want to make it scandalous or sweet? Let's go sweet, Ethan said. People are more likely to believe it. And because you're actually sweet, she teased. He didn't answer, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Later that night, Ethan stood by the window of his room, staring out at the moonlight dancing across the lake. Somewhere in the house, Lila was probably doing the same, replaying the day, questioning the risks, wondering if she'd made the right choice. He thought about her hands trembling in the sunroom, about her voice when she said, "You just gave me my life back." He hadn't done it for recognition or out of duty. He'd done it because he saw a young woman who was brave enough to ask for help and still kind enough not to demand it. And deep down, something told him, this wasn't going to be pretend for long. The morning after their courthouse visit, the estate stirred with new energy. Florists arrived in unmarked vans. Tailors called 3 times. Lila's personal assistant, someone Ethan had never seen before, appeared like a storm cloud in high heels, waving garment bags and fielding calls in clipped whispers. By noon, the announcement had been made. A photo of Lila and Ethan standing outside the courthouse, snapped by an anonymous passerby, had hit the digital news circuit like wildfire. The caption read, "Heiress Lila Beaumont weds local mechanic in quiet ceremony." Reactions ranged from shock to curiosity to outright scandal. The Whitmore family went silent. That, Lila said with an almost guilty smile, was a victory. Ethan, meanwhile, stayed mostly out of the way, fixing a broken door hinge in the mudroom, helping Maria lift heavy grocery boxes, and avoiding the media calls Lila's assistant tried to push on him. He wasn't trying to be difficult, but the more attention this drew, the more it reminded him why he had left that world in the first place. That afternoon, as the last of the media frenzy died down, Lila found him on the back terrace, kneeling beside a small gardening shed. The door had come off its top hinge, and he was carefully setting it back into place. "You're not very good at being a trophy husband," she teased lightly. He glanced up, squinting against the sunlight. "Is that what I'm supposed to be?" She shrugged. "It's what they expect." He hammered once, tested the door, and stood. "Let them keep guessing." There was a pause between them, the kind that had started to feel familiar. Not tense, but not easy either. An in-between space, as if their story hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be yet. "I thought you might want a tour," Lila said finally. "You've been living here for 2 days and haven't seen half of it." Ethan hesitated. "You want to give a tour of this place?" "I want you to know the parts that matter," she said. "The ones that feel like mine." So he followed her inside, through corridors of antique woodwork and crystal sconces, into rooms that smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. She showed him the music room, where her grandmother used to play the cello, the library where Lila would hide in the afternoons with books about astronomy, the side hallway, still faintly marked with crayon from when she was 7 and tried to draw her own fairy tale castle. Ethan saw the estate begin to shift in his mind, from marble and mahogany to memories and meaning. Eventually they reached the greenhouse, a glass structure nestled against the west wing, framed in white painted iron and glowing with late afternoon light. "This was her favorite place," Lila said, stepping inside. The air was warm, sweet, with the scent of lemon balm and gardenias. "My grandmother used to say that even in the coldest winters, something always found a way to bloom." Ethan looked around. Dozens of potted plants lined the brick floor, some thriving, some barely holding on. In the center sat a small metal bench beneath an arch of climbing roses. "You kept it going," he said quietly. Lila nodded. "I tried." He studied her in the soft light, the careful way she touched the soil, the quiet reverence in her voice. She didn't seem like the woman on magazine covers or financial reports. Here she was something simpler, and somehow more radiant. "Why did you really ask me?" he asked, the question escaping before he could pull it back. She glanced at him. "I told you. You told me you needed help, but you didn't pick just anyone. There are plenty of people who would have jumped at the chance." She was silent for a long beat. Then she sat on the bench and looked out through the glass roof where clouds passed slowly across the sky. "I've been watching you for weeks," she said finally. "After I moved back here, I needed work done, and someone in town suggested you. But I didn't call right away. I came into town. I saw how people talked about you, how you helped Mrs. Alder fix her car and refuse payment, how you stayed late at the garage when the high school kid's truck broke down. You didn't just do your job, Ethan. You showed up. You were kind and real." He sat beside her, letting that settle. "I didn't want a man who'd say yes because of money," she continued. "I wanted someone who might actually care what happened to me, even just a little." Ethan looked at her, his voice low. "That's a dangerous kind of hope," she smiled. "It's the only kind I had left." They sat there for a while in silence. Outside, a gust of wind rustled the leaves. Inside, the sunlight turned amber as it filtered through the glass and caught in her hair. Then Lila stood and brushed her hands on her jeans. "Dinner's in an hour." Ethan stayed behind, letting her go. The greenhouse, with its quiet warmth and fragile blooms, felt like a secret he hadn't been ready to uncover. He looked around once more, then turned to leave. But just before he stepped outside, his eyes fell on a small wooden planter tucked behind a row of aloe. Half buried in the soil was a tiny metal tag, weathered but readable, "For things worth waiting for." Ethan didn't know if it referred to the plants, to love, or to something else entirely. But as he stood there, watching the light fade, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, what was beginning between them wasn't pretend anymore. The whispers began 2 days after the announcement. They started small, an online forum, a curious blog post, a social media thread. But by Friday morning, someone had unearthed a headline from 7 years ago. Young CEO Ethan Cole resigns after takeover shakeup. The article was brief. No scandal, no lawsuits, just a statement. Cole cites personal reasons for stepping down. Declines interviews. Lila found it first. She was sitting at the kitchen island, barefoot and half listening to Maria complain about the noise from the lawn crew, when her assistant forwarded the article. It hit her like a sudden gust of wind. She clicked through a few more links. Investor profiles, industry write-ups, Forbes lists from the early 2010s. Ethan Cole, founder and CEO of Axis Logics, a revolutionary logistics software company that nearly redefined supply chain integration across 3 continents. Acquired in 2016 by a rival firm, Cole vanished from the public eye soon after. Gone. Just like that. She turned in her chair and looked out toward the driveway where Ethan stood, chatting with the gardener about the irrigation system. He had never mentioned any of it, not once. That afternoon, she found him in the garage behind the estate, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in the guts of an old lawn tractor that hadn't run in years. He was humming, off-key, relaxed, and for a moment, she felt almost guilty, as if she had stumbled into a part of him he had wanted to keep hidden. "I saw something today," she said softly. Ethan looked up, blinking against the sunlight. "Oh?" She held up her phone, the article still glowing on the screen. He didn't even squint at it. "I wondered when that would show up," he said. "You didn't think to tell me?" she asked, not accusing, just curious. Ethan stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "I didn't think it mattered." She folded her arms. "You don't think your entire past as a tech prodigy and CEO matters when you're standing in a billionaire's house pretending to be her husband?" He smiled faintly. "The pretending part, maybe. But the rest? That's not who I am anymore." "But it was," she said, stepping closer. "And it explains a lot. The way you carry yourself. The way you think. You didn't walk away from something small, Ethan. You walked away from a legacy." He met her gaze, calm and unshaken. "No, I walked away from a world where people became numbers and relationships became leverage. I built something I was proud of. Then I watched it get gutted by people who only cared about stock value. I stayed long enough to see it turn into something I didn't recognize. So I left." "You never wanted to go back?" He shook his head. "I wanted peace. I wanted real conversations, real work. I wanted to build something with my hands, not just spreadsheets and IPO pitches." Lila watched him. There was no regret in his voice, just clarity, honesty, a quiet resolve that came from surviving something that changed him. She leaned against the doorframe. "My family would think you're crazy." He chuckled. "They already do." There was a beat of silence. Then she said, "You know they're going to ask you about this at the charity gala tomorrow." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Gala?" Lila gave him a sheepish smile. "Sorry, forgot to mention. It's a Beaumont Foundation event. Press, donors, board members, all expecting to meet the mystery husband." He groaned. "Do I have to wear a tie?" "At least a jacket." He threw the rag onto the workbench. "You're lucky I still own one." The next evening, the ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers. Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his gray blazer and tugged once at his collar, feeling like a fish in a 5-star aquarium. Lila, in a midnight blue gown that made her look like she stepped out of a dream, slipped her arm through his and smiled at him with quiet reassurance. "You're doing great," she whispered. "I haven't even said anything yet." "Exactly. Best part so far." They moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her leading, him observing. A few whispered greetings, a nod from a senator. Champagne flutes passed on silver trays. Then a voice called out from behind them. "Well, I'll be damned. Ethan Cole." Ethan turned, and for a heartbeat, his past materialized in the form of a silver-haired man with a wolfish grin. "Russell Drake," Ethan said, the name dry in his throat. "You're full of surprises," Russell laughed. "Marrying into the Beaumont Empire now? Last I heard, you were off the grid in Vermont." "Connecticut," Ethan corrected politely. Russell looked Lila up and down with appraising eyes. "Well played." Lila's grip on Ethan's arm tightened, just slightly. "What brings you here, Russell?" Ethan asked, voice even. Board seat on the tech initiative, he replied, sipping his drink. Trying to drag some of these nonprofits into the modern world. You should join us. Bet you've got a few ideas left in that head. I'm sure you have plenty of ideas without me, Russell grinned. Still the same old Cole. Smart enough to build an empire, stubborn enough to walk away from it. He raised his glass and wandered off. Lila turned to Ethan. Friend? Used to be, Ethan said simply. Later, as the gala wound down and the cameras disappeared, Lila and Ethan stood on a balcony overlooking the gardens below. The night air was cool, crisp with the scent of pine and earth. You didn't flinch, she said. Ethan shrugged. That man is part of the reason I left. He's on my father's advisory board. Of course he is. Lila looked at him, her voice softer now. You're not what I expected, Ethan. He smiled. Neither are you. For a moment, the world seemed very far away. The gala, the inheritance, the headlines. It was just the two of them, in the hush of the night, held together by something still unnamed. You know, she said, you could probably still run a company like that. You have the mind for it. He looked at her carefully. I also have the scars for it. She nodded. But you didn't let it break you. No, he said, but it changed me. They stood in silence side by side, not touching but close. The lights inside cast a golden glow behind them, but out here on the balcony, everything was quiet. And for the first time since the day they met, Lila realized she didn't feel like she was pretending anymore. Neither did he. The storm rolled in just after midnight. It started with wind, restless and insistent, rattling the window panes of the old estate like an impatient guest. Then came the rain, steady and cold, tapping against the glass roof of the greenhouse, pounding down on the slate tiles outside. Thunder cracked in the distance, low and rumbling, like the earth remembering something it had forgotten. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep had eluded him for hours. The gala still lingered in his mind. The hum of the ballroom, the press of bodies, the glint in Russell Drake's eyes. But more than anything, it was the look Lila had given him on that balcony. Not gratitude, not relief. Something softer, warmer, almost longing. And that was dangerous. He wasn't supposed to feel this way. Not in a fake marriage. Not when they had an expiration date. A sudden knock at his door pulled him upright. It was soft, hesitant, not the kind of knock that demanded attention, but the kind that asked permission. He crossed the room and opened the door. Lila stood in the hallway barefoot, arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her silk robe clung to her shoulders, damp from the hallway's chilled air. Her hair was loose, slightly tousled, as if sleep had abandoned her too. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I know it's late. I shouldn't have. Ethan stepped aside without a word and let her in. She walked slowly, as if unsure whether she should stay. Her eyes looked brighter than usual, not teary exactly, but tired in a way that came from something deeper than lack of sleep. I couldn't stop thinking, she said, her voice low, about the gala, about everything. I know this was never supposed to get complicated, but... She trailed off, glancing down at her hands. Ethan watched her carefully. But it did. She nodded once, and silence settled between them. Outside, rain lashed the windows. I used to be good at staying in control, she murmured. I used to know what I wanted, or at least what people wanted from me. But lately, every time I look at you, I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know if I'm acting or just hoping. Ethan crossed the room, slowly, deliberately. He stopped just in front of her. You're not the only one wondering, he said. This was supposed to be simple, and it's anything but. She looked up at him then, and the space between them thinned like a breath held too long. I don't want to pretend tonight, she whispered. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't seduction. It was a surrender. Ethan reached out gently and brushed a damp strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered, not for long, but enough to steady something in her. Her eyes closed briefly at the touch. You're safe here, he said. Lila exhaled slowly and nodded, her arms falling to her sides. He walked to the corner armchair and pulled down the extra blanket draped across it. Without a word, he guided her to the bed, tucked the blanket around her, then sat beside her. on top of the covers, fully dressed like a sentry at his post. They didn't speak again for a while. She lay on her side facing him, her breathing slowing. The storm outside softened, its violence beginning to fade into rhythm. Ethan sat still, gaze fixed on the wall, the faint light from the hallway casting a gold outline around them both. "I used to lie in this bed as a kid," Lila said suddenly. "Every summer I spent here, this was my room. Back then, everything felt magical, safe, like the world stopped at the edge of this estate and nothing bad could get in." He turned toward her. "What changed?" "My father," she said softly. "He stopped coming here after my grandmother died. Stopped smiling. I think he resented how much I loved this place, how much I loved her, because she saw me, not the air, just me." Ethan reached out and took her hand. He didn't squeeze, just held it, palm against palm, a quiet promise. "She'd be proud of you," he said, "for standing up, for finding your own way." Lila's lips curved faintly. "You don't even know her." "I know you," he said. The storm outside faded into silence. And in that quiet they drifted, not into sleep, not yet, but into something gentler, something nameless. In the morning, sunlight broke through the clouds. Ethan stirred to find Lila still beside him, her hand still in his. Her breathing was soft even. She looked younger in sleep, free of the armor she wore in daylight, and something inside him softened in response. He hadn't come here for this. He hadn't said yes to be her protector, or her anchor, or whatever she needed that night. But somehow he'd become those things. And more frightening than that, he wanted to be. Carefully he stood and pulled the covers up over her shoulders. He didn't wake her, didn't speak, just stood for a moment, watching the early light turn her hair to gold. Then he left the room, his footsteps quiet on the wood. Downstairs the house was still. The staff hadn't arrived yet. A pot of coffee sat brewing in the kitchen, the scent rich and familiar. Ethan poured a cup and stepped onto the back porch. The storm had passed. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. The world felt cleaner somehow, like it had shaken something off in the night. Behind him, the woman he had married for pretend was asleep in his bed, and every part of him knew, whatever this had started as, it wasn't pretend anymore. Lila hadn't intended to host another event so soon after the gala, but the annual Beaumont Foundation Legacy Dinner was non-negotiable. An institution older than she was, held every fall to honor donors and board members who'd shaped the family's vast philanthropic empire. This time the ballroom felt different. Perhaps it was the shift in the air, or maybe it was something deeper, something inside her that no longer felt like pretending. She had walked through this room 100 times over the years, but tonight, as she entered on Ethan's arm, she felt grounded in a way she never had before. This time she wasn't on display. She wasn't here to prove anything. She was simply here, with him. The guests rose to their feet as they were announced. Mrs. Lila Beaumont Cole and Mr. Ethan Cole. The name still felt foreign in her ears, but it rang with a weight she was beginning to carry proudly. Ethan leaned closer and whispered, "Remind me again why we're doing this?" "Because half these people think I married a gold-digging handyman," she murmured, "and the other half think you're a figment of my imagination." "Well," he said, straightening his jacket, "let's not disappoint." They moved through the crowd with more ease than either expected. Lila greeted donors. Ethan shook hands with polite restraint, and more than one guest raised an eyebrow in surprise at the man who didn't quite fit their mold of a society husband, but somehow managed to rise above it. At the center of the room, seated near the Beaumont patriarch's empty chair, sat a cluster of old family allies and board members. Among them was a name Ethan hadn't heard in years, Mitchell Harrington. A silver-haired powerhouse of old Wall Street money, Harrington had once served on the advisory board of Ethan's former company. He'd been one of the voices urging Ethan to let go and move on when the hostile takeover was brewing. He hadn't expected to see Harrington tonight, but there he was, seated beside Lila's father, whispering something behind a champagne flute. As they approached, Harrington looked up and smiled. It was the kind of smile Ethan remembered well, polite, sharp, and empty. "Well, Mr. Cole," he said, rising, "it's been a long time." Ethan offered a firm handshake. "It has." "I must admit," Harrington continued, "when I heard the announcement, I thought it was a publicity stunt, but seeing you two together, it seems our dear Lila has a talent for surprise. She always has, Ethan said, glancing at her with a soft smile. Lila squeezed his hand beneath the table. Her father hadn't acknowledged them yet, not directly. He sat stone-faced, a glass of whiskey untouched before him. Lila, her father said finally, his voice low but clear. May I have a word? Ethan stepped aside as she followed her father toward a small anteroom off the ballroom. The door clicked shut behind them, leaving Ethan standing beside Harrington under the golden sconces. She's always been headstrong, Harrington said, sipping his drink. But this, marrying a man like you, it's not just impulsive, it's reckless. Ethan turned to him, calm but firm. She didn't ask for your approval. Maybe not, the older man said smoothly. But don't mistake admiration for acceptance. The circles you've entered, they remember everything. Your fall, your silence. They'll dig. They'll spin. Ethan's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. You were a promising name once, Harrington went on, but promising doesn't pay the bills. Stability does. Control does. Ethan let out a soft breath. You still don't get it, do you? Harrington blinked. I didn't leave because I failed, Ethan said. I left because I refused to become what you are. The silence that followed was sharp as broken glass. Lila returned moments later, her face unreadable. Her father didn't follow. They danced later that evening, not because it was expected, but because the orchestra began playing something slow, and the room needed a moment of softness. Ethan's hand found hers instinctively. As they moved beneath the chandelier's glow, her head tilted slightly against his shoulder. Are you all right? He asked. She nodded. He said I've embarrassed the family, that marrying you was a betrayal. Ethan swallowed. And what did you say? I told him, she whispered, that for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I belonged to anyone else. And that was the most loyal thing I've ever done for myself. He closed his eyes briefly. You're braver than anyone in this room. She looked up at him. I'm not pretending anymore, Ethan. Neither was he. The dance ended, but neither of them let go. Later, as the guests filtered out and the lights dimmed, Ethan stood beside her near the arched windows of the ballroom. You were incredible tonight, he said. So were you, she replied. You handled Harrington better than most politicians could have. He gave a half smile. I meant what I said to him. I'm not ashamed of leaving. I just didn't expect to come back, especially like this. You came back for me, she said, and something in her voice trembled. That means more than you know. Ethan brushed a curl from her face, his thumb tracing lightly along her cheek. I didn't come back for a second chance at the business world, he said. I came back because you were standing alone in a storm, and I remembered what it felt like. She reached for his hand, and this time, when their fingers entwined, it didn't feel like a roll. It felt like a beginning. The sun dipped lower over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the gardens as autumn crept deeper into the leaves. The air had turned cooler, brisk enough for jackets, and the estate grounds shimmered in fading light. Ethan was in the workshop just off the garden path, sleeves rolled up and fingers stained with grease, coaxing life back into an old riding mower that had been left to rust. He liked the quiet out here. No headlines, no sideways glances, just the sound of tools clicking into place and the hum of birdsong from the trees beyond. He didn't hear her at first. Lila stood in the doorway, arms folded, watching him work with a quiet curiosity she hadn't yet learned how to explain. In the soft light, the back of his neck caught a thin line of sunlight, his posture relaxed but focused. There was a peace in his movements, an honesty she couldn't find in boardrooms or between the lines of contracts. She cleared her throat gently. Ethan looked up, brushing his hands on a rag. Hey, didn't hear you. You're good with anything that has moving parts, aren't you? She said with a half smile. He chuckled. Most of the time, except espresso machines. Still trying to figure that one out. She stepped into the workshop, the scent of old wood and engine oil thick around her. There's something I wanted to show you, she said. He raised a brow, setting down his wrench. That sounds suspicious. Eddie. She ignored him and held out a hand. Come on. 10 minutes later, They were walking side by side through the orchard at the far end of the property. Most of the apples had fallen already, the trees sparse and winding, branches dark against the amber sky. "This used to be my favorite spot," she said. "When I was little, I'd come out here with my grandmother and pretend we owned nothing but these trees. She'd tell me stories about growing up during the war, and I'd ask her what she wanted to be if she could be anything." "What did she say?" "She said, free." They stopped beneath one of the oldest trees, its thick trunk bent from decades of wind. A wooden bench sat nearby, its paint chipped and faded. Lila sat first, pulling her knees close to her chest. Ethan settled beside her. "I keep thinking about that word," she said after a pause. "Free, what it means, what it costs." He glanced at her, waiting. "I spent my whole life trying to be who they wanted," she continued. "Perfect daughter, future CEO, measured, polished, useful. But every time I got closer to their version of success, I felt further from myself." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know that feeling." "I believe you do." She turned to him, eyes softer now. "That night in the greenhouse, when I told you why I chose you, I left something out." He tilted his head. "What's that?" "I didn't just choose you because you were kind. I chose you because, for the first time in a long time, I looked at someone and didn't feel small." Ethan's expression shifted, guarded at first, then something warmer. "I wasn't pretending that night either," he said quietly. They sat there a while, letting the wind move around them. A few leaves floated down from the canopy, landing softly at their feet. Then Lila turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I ask you something? Anything. If this weren't pretend, if it were real, would it be so terrible?" Ethan's breath caught. He looked at her then. Not like the woman who'd pulled him into this charade. Not the heiress or the billionaire's daughter. Just her. The way the light haloed her hair. The way her eyes didn't flinch. He reached for her hand. And in the quiet, with no fanfare and no contract, he leaned in. Their lips met. Soft, hesitant, then certain. It wasn't rushed or dramatic. It was a question and an answer. A breaking point. A beginning. When they pulled apart, neither spoke right away. But Lila smiled, wide and honest. "That didn't feel fake." "It wasn't," Ethan said. They walked back to the house slowly, shoulders brushing, steps unhurried. The orchard behind them glowed like memory. Inside the kitchen, Maria was setting down a tray of roasted vegetables for dinner. She paused when she saw them. Something in the way they walked in together made her smile knowingly. Ethan caught her eye, and Maria simply gave a little nod before slipping away. They ate in the breakfast nook that night. No long table, no candles. Just 2 plates, 2 glasses of wine, and the sound of distant jazz playing softly from an old radio on the windowsill. "You're different tonight," Lila said, twirling her fork idly. "So are you." They looked at each other then, and both knew without speaking. Something had changed. The rules had shifted. The script had been tossed aside, and neither of them wanted to go back. Later, as Lila walked him to his room, she hesitated at the door. Her hand lingered on the knob. "I should say goodnight," she said. "You should." But neither moved. Finally, Ethan stepped forward and kissed her forehead gently. "Sleep well, Mrs. Cole." Lila blushed, really blushed, and walked away, her bare feet soft against the hardwood. And in the quiet that followed, Ethan leaned against the door and smiled to himself. He had come here for a contract, an escape, a chance to help someone reclaim her life. But somehow, in the middle of all that, he had found something he hadn't known he was missing. Something real. The silence was sharper than the shouting. It was the kind of silence that settled into the walls of a house like dust. Quiet, invisible, but impossible to ignore. Ethan felt it the moment he stepped into the drawing room late Monday afternoon. Lila was standing by the fireplace, her back to him, phone clutched tightly in one hand, her shoulders still. He waited a beat before speaking. "Lila?" She turned slowly, and for the first time since he met her, there was no composure in her eyes. No mask, just raw edges. "They're filing to dissolve the trust," she said. Ethan stepped closer. "What?" "My father, my uncle, the advisory board. They've called an emergency vote. They're claiming I've compromised the family's reputation and the foundation's leadership structure by marrying you. Ethan blinked. But that's absurd. You're still the legal heir. They're using a clause I didn't know existed, one that allows the board to demand a review of succession if a primary heir is deemed unstable or misaligned with the legacy's vision. In other words, Ethan said bitterly, you married beneath you. Lila gave a sharp, humorless laugh. Yes, that's exactly what they think. He looked at her, the weight of it all settling in his chest. What do you need me to do? Her eyes flicked to him, startled. What? You said you brought me into this to hold the door open, to give you room to breathe. If now's the part where I help you walk through it, just tell me what that looks like. She hesitated. I don't know. I thought I was ready to fight them. But now they're threatening to dismantle everything my grandmother built, and I don't know if I have the power to stop them. Ethan took a step forward. Then we fight back, together. I'm not asking you to. You didn't have to, he said. I'm not here because of an agreement anymore. She stared at him, emotions warring across her face. Gratitude, fear, affection, doubt. But you walked away from this world once. Why would you walk back into it now? He didn't hesitate. Because you're standing in the middle of the fire, and I can't just watch you burn. That night, while Lila met with legal counsel and board advisors, Ethan pulled out the suit he hadn't worn since the gala. He found a tie, rewatched a press conference from 5 years ago to reacquaint himself with the language of boardrooms and power plays, and dusted off the mind he thought he'd buried beneath bolts and wrenches. The next morning, they walked into the Beaumont Group headquarters side by side. The boardroom was polished oak and glass, sterile and glittering with cold intention. 12 men and women sat behind a long table. Lila's father sat at the head, flanked by Harrington and 2 others Ethan didn't recognize. Ethan let Lila speak first. Her voice was calm, measured, but determined. I was not made to be an extension of someone else's ambition, she said, and I will not be stripped of my inheritance because I chose integrity over appearance. A murmur passed down the table. Her father's expression remained unreadable. Then Harrington leaned forward. Miss Beaumont, Mrs. Cole, Ethan corrected smoothly. A few heads turned. Harrington raised a brow. Mrs. Cole, then, while your passion is admirable, this board has serious concerns about your judgment, about your choices. Ethan stepped forward. Then perhaps your concern should shift to the choices that were made before I ever entered the picture. There was a pause. Ethan took it. For the record, he said, I didn't marry Lila to gain access to her name, her fortune, or her father's company. I married her because I believed she deserved the right to choose her own path. He turned to the board. And while we're talking about poor judgment, let's talk about how you handled the Orenfield project last quarter. The numbers were publicly filed. You buried the loss under regional expansion. Murmurs sharpened. I built a company from scratch, he continued, and watched it fall into the hands of people who saw every human being as a line item. I walked away because I didn't want to become one of them, and I came back now because I saw the same pattern forming around Lila. One of the younger board members shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She's not unstable. She's not reckless. She's evolving. And if that scares you, then maybe the problem isn't her. Maybe it's a legacy that's grown too afraid of becoming human again. Silence filled the room. When they left the meeting, Ethan didn't ask Lila how she thought it went. She answered anyway once they were outside in the cool morning light. They're not going to vote today. They're stalling, which means they're scared. Good, he said, but Lila didn't smile. Not really. I didn't want you to have to do that. I wanted to, he said simply, because I love you. The words landed between them like a dropped match. Lila stared at him, her throat tight. Say that again. I love you, he said. Not because of who you were, or what you had, or what you were trying to escape. I love you because you're the first person who made me want to show up again, fully. Without a script, without running. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, pressing her face against his chest. And for the first time since her grandmother's funeral, Lila let herself cry without shame. Not from fear, but from the terrifying relief of being fully seen. The downtown conference room was 25 floors above the street, all glass and gleam, the kind of sterile corporate beauty Ethan had sworn off years ago. He stood at the head of the long table, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, a digital projector humming beside him. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat untouched beside his notes. Across from him sat a group of Beaumont Group executives, people who, 3 weeks earlier, had barely acknowledged him. Today they leaned in when he spoke. Today they listened. And if we realign our logistics network through Midwestern suppliers instead of relying on over-leveraged coastal ports, we reduce delivery lag time by 21% while simultaneously cutting costs by nearly $7 million annually, he concluded. A murmur passed through the room. Ethan stepped back from the projection and let the numbers speak for themselves. For the past 10 days, he'd buried himself in data. Late nights, early mornings, reviewing operational reports, financial forecasts, staff memos. He hadn't done this in years, and yet the rhythm returned like a language he hadn't spoken in a long time, but never forgot. He looked around the room, saw the skepticism thinning. These weren't people who bent easily, but facts were facts. One executive, Rachel Ung, sharp-eyed and quietly powerful, closed her binder and leaned forward. "I'll admit it," she said. "That's the clearest, cleanest plan I've seen for this division since 2019. Who drafted your model?" "I did," Ethan said. She tilted her head. "We were wrong to underestimate you." He nodded once. "I know." It wasn't arrogance. It was experience. After the meeting, as the executives filtered out, Lila stepped in through the side door, arms folded, expression unreadable. "I heard," she said. "You turned the room." Ethan reached for his coffee. It had gone cold. "We'll see." "No," she said. "I know that look. You've seen the wall start to crack." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "I didn't come back to win anyone over, Lila. I came back to buy you time." "I know," she said gently. He looked at her then. Her face was calm, but her eyes were full. Of admiration, yes, but something else too. Worry, wonder. A question she hadn't yet asked. "Are you okay?" she finally said. "I'm tired," he admitted. "But more than that, I'm awake. It's strange. Like I stepped back into the world I used to belong to. And instead of feeling trapped, I feel..." He paused, searching for the word. "Anchored." She crossed to him and touched his arm. "You're not who you used to be, Ethan, but you didn't lose that part of you. You just redirected it." He smiled. "I used to build things to prove I could. Now I want to build things that last." They stood in the quiet together, the hum of the city below them. That evening, Lila hosted a board reception at the estate. Not for show, not for press, but for the staff, the regional managers, the silent engine behind the family name. People who had never seen the inside of the mansion, but had made the wheels turn for decades. Ethan moved through the gathering with surprising ease. He shook hands with shipping coordinators, complimented the IT head on a recent system overhaul, and spent 20 minutes explaining a revamped inventory algorithm to a logistics intern who nearly cried from gratitude. Later, as the staff began to trickle out, Ethan and Lila walked the grounds in the quiet hush of post-event stillness. The night air was cool, the stars bright against a velvet sky. They strolled down the winding path near the greenhouse, where string lights flickered overhead. "I saw the way they looked at you tonight," Lila said softly. "Not because you impressed them, but because you respected them. They've earned it." "I don't know if I ever looked at my family's business that way," she admitted. "It was always a fortress to protect. Something inherited, not earned." "You're not your father," he said, "or your uncle. You're rebuilding it in your own image now. And that's rare." She stopped walking, turned to him. "Do you ever miss it?" He thought about it. The late nights, the pressure, the thrill of watching a system come together, the rush of solving something no one else could. "I miss the purpose," he said. "Not the noise, not the politics. You have purpose now." "I do," he said, "but I'm still trying to figure out what kind." They walked a few more steps in silence. Then Lila stopped again. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "Not in this world. You came back for me. You helped me hold my place. But if it's pulling you somewhere you don't want to go again..." He turned to face her. "Lila," he said, "you are my place now." Her breath caught. You helped me remember who I was. But more than that, you showed me who I could be. She stepped closer, their hands meeting without hesitation this time. I don't want to inherit an empire if it costs me you, she whispered. You won't, he said. But maybe we don't need to stay here. Maybe once the dust settles, we walk away. On our terms. You mean it? I do. They kissed beneath the light strung between the trees, a kiss that was neither urgent nor dramatic, but full, whole, built on a foundation they had laid together, brick by careful brick. The legacy would remain, the battles would finish, but tonight they chose each other, and that was the only foundation that truly mattered. The formal offer came on a crisp Thursday morning, a cream-colored envelope delivered by private courier. No pomp, no seal, just heavy paper and a letterhead that bore the weight of 4 generations of the Beaumont legacy. Leela read the contents at the kitchen island, her fingers tightening around the edge of the page as she moved from sentence to sentence. Ethan sat across from her, still nursing his first cup of coffee, watching the way her expression shifted, first surprise, then suspicion, and finally a quiet resignation. They're handing it over, she said, placing the letter between them. The entire trust? She nodded. All of it. Control of the board, majority voting shares, full executive power. And the catch? He asked. Lila exhaled. I stay. I remain CEO. I play the part. No sudden withdrawals, no restructuring, no rebranding. They want continuity, Beaumont as it always was, but now with me as its face. Ethan leaned back in his chair. It's everything they took from you. It is, she said, and everything I thought I wanted. The kitchen went quiet except for the soft tick of the antique clock above the stove. Outside, the maple trees had begun to let go of their final leaves. The air was full of change. Lila turned the letter over in her hands. It's funny, a month ago I would have done anything for this. And now? Ethan asked gently. She looked at him, really looked at him. Now I'm not so sure the prize is worth the price. That afternoon they drove north. No schedule, no agenda, just a need to escape the mansion's echoing corridors and the boardroom's invisible chains. Lila wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair tied back in a loose braid. Ethan drove with the windows down, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near hers on the center console. Their silence wasn't heavy. It was full, like a well-worn quilt that needed no words to warm. They stopped at a small diner off Route 27, linoleum floors, burnt coffee, the kind of place that served honesty with a side of hash browns. Ethan stirred his coffee. You know, they don't expect you to say no. I know. They'll think you're wasting it. Let them. He looked at her, brow furrowed. So what's the plan, Lila? She met his gaze. We walk away. He didn't blink. You're sure? I'm sure of you, she said. And I'm sure that I don't want a life that fits a mold someone else made for me. I want quiet mornings. I want dirt under my nails. I want to build something that's ours, not theirs. He smiled, slow and steady. Where do you want to go? Anywhere that doesn't have a boardroom. Montana? He offered. She laughed. Too cold. New Mexico? Too dry. He reached across the table and took her hand. How about wherever we end up? Perfect, she said. When they returned to the estate the next evening, Lila sat at her grandmother's old desk and drafted 2 letters. One was to the board, formal, courteous, and final. The other was to the staff of the foundation, expressing gratitude and encouragement for their work, and announcing her stepping down to pursue a quieter life. Ethan watched her from the doorway, arms folded, pride warming his chest. You know, he said softly, you've always had the power. She looked up, pen paused mid-signature. And I never wanted it. You wanted peace, he said, and now you have it. The next week passed like closing a chapter. Meetings were scheduled, but brief. Interviews requested, but declined. Her father didn't call. Harrington sent a one-line email that said, I hope you know what you're doing. She did. The day they left, Maria hugged them both with teary eyes and a soft blessing in Spanish. Lila handed her the keys and smiled. Keep the lights on. Someone might come back someday. Their car was already packed. Duffels of simple clothes, Ethan's toolbox, 2 mugs from the kitchen, and one framed photograph, a candid picture of them in the greenhouse, laughing, unaware a camera had ever been near. As they pulled away from the estate gates, Lila didn't look back. Neither did Ethan. They drove west. Some days they stayed in roadside inns with peeling wallpaper and stories in the floors. Other days they parked by open fields and drank coffee under the stars. They cooked over campfires, fixed flat tires together, and learned to laugh at things they couldn't control. Eventually they found a small town nestled between the Blue Ridge Mountains and a lake that shimmered at dawn, a town with a vacant barn and a fixer-upper farmhouse, a town where no one knew their last names, only that they were kind and hardworking and in love. They bought the house. Ethan opened a small workshop in the barn. Lila grew herbs and built a roadside flower stand. On weekends, they volunteered at the local school, helped an elderly neighbor rebuild her porch, and watched the seasons turn without needing permission. One morning, as frost kissed the windows and the scent of cinnamon filled the kitchen, Lila handed Ethan a letter. He opened it slowly. Inside was a birth certificate application. "I wanted to ask," she said, voice quiet. "Not assume." He looked at her, wonder softening every line of his face. "You want to start a family?" "I want to build something that can't be bought," she said. "Something that roots us." He crossed the room and kissed her, long and slow. "We already have," he whispered. And as snow began to fall gently outside, they stood in the kitchen, two people who had once agreed to a marriage of convenience and had found instead the purest kind of love. The morning light spilled through the windows like honey. It slid across the old wooden floorboards, warmed the chipped edges of the farmhouse's kitchen table, and caught the steam rising from two mismatched coffee mugs. Outside, a soft wind rustled through the pine trees, and beyond them, the snow-capped peaks of Montana stood like ancient sentinels beneath a brightening sky. Ethan leaned back in his chair, cradling his mug between his hands. Across from him, Lila sat with her feet tucked beneath her, wearing one of his old flannel shirts and a serene expression that hadn't visited her face in years. They had been living here for 6 months now, not hiding, just living. A quiet life, a good life. One built not on legacies or contracts or appearances, but on peace and kindness and choices freely made. Ethan glanced at her over the rim of his mug. "You know," he said, "this might be the first time in my life I've been this still and not felt the need to fix something." Lila smiled, eyes soft. "You fix plenty." He grinned. "Like that fence that keeps falling every time the wind picks up?" "I was thinking more along the lines of hearts. Mine especially." He reached across the table and brushed his fingers along hers. The touch was simple, familiar, a language they now spoke fluently without ever needing words. They'd rebuilt the old barn into a workshop and a tiny studio, where Ethan now repaired everything from tractors to antique clocks. Word had spread in town. That guy with the rough hands and the soft voice, who never charged too much and always remembered your dog's name. Lila, meanwhile, had turned the backyard into rows of raised garden beds. She grew herbs, vegetables, and wildflowers, selling little bundles tied in twine at the weekend market. The people who bought from her didn't care that she was once heir to an empire. They cared that her basil stayed fresh for weeks and that she always smiled when she gave you change. They were known as Ethan and Lila. No last names, no headlines, just two people who showed up. Together. It wasn't perfect. The roof leaked when it rained too hard. The heating sputtered some nights. And some mornings Lila still woke from dreams where her father's voice echoed in the dark. But when that happened, Ethan would pull her close, press his lips to her temple, and remind her, "You're here. You're safe. You're free." And she would breathe again. On this morning, as they sipped their coffee and listened to the creak of the house settling into the new day, a small envelope lay between them on the table. Ethan tapped it gently with one finger. "Still sure about this?" Lila nodded, smile deepening. More than ever. The envelope contained their application to adopt. It hadn't been a rushed decision. Nothing about their life together was. But after months of living in a place that felt like home, not just in geography, but in spirit, they both knew it was time to share it with someone else. They weren't looking for the perfect child, just one who needed what they now had to give. Love without condition, stability without judgment, and a future full of laughter and second chances. Lila reached for the envelope, slid it into her tote bag, and stood. You coming with me to drop it off? Always. They drove into town under a pale blue sky. The adoption agency was inside a modest building beside the library. Nothing fancy, just a clean lobby, a kind receptionist, and a bulletin board full of knitted baby booties and thank you cards. When Lila handed over the envelope, the woman behind the desk smiled and said, "We've heard good things about you too." Ethan chuckled. "Don't believe all of it. I still can't fix that fence." On the way back, they stopped by the diner where they'd first discovered Montana's finest sour cherry pie. The waitress greeted them like old friends, poured their coffee without asking, and left them to their booth by the window. Lila traced a finger along the rim of her mug. "Do you ever think about what life would have looked like if I hadn't called you about that sink?" Ethan looked at her, quiet for a moment. "I think about it every day," he said. "And every time I realize I wouldn't have answered that call if I hadn't already been looking for something more. Something real." Lila reached across the table and took his hand. "We saved each other," she whispered. He nodded. "And we keep doing it, one morning at a time." They finished their pie and coffee, then walked hand in hand down the sidewalk as snowflakes began to drift from the sky like promises. Back at home, they lit a fire in the wood stove and curled up on the worn leather couch, legs tangled, blankets draped over their laps. Through the window, the world was turning white, soft and quiet and full of wonder. Lila rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. "I used to think love had to be earned," she said, "that I had to be useful to be wanted." Ethan kissed the top of her head. "And now? Now I know love shows up when you least expect it. In the form of a man with calloused hands fixing a sink." He laughed. "To be fair, it was a very broken sink. You fixed more than you know." They sat that way as the afternoon turned to evening, and the snow kept falling outside. Each flake a reminder that life, like love, is made up of moments you can't predict, but can always choose. And in the quiet of that Montana farmhouse, 2 cups of coffee now cold on the table, a mechanic and a billionaire bride who once made a deal for convenience had built something better than an empire. They had built a home, together. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop the name of your city or country in the comments below. It's always heartwarming to see how far these stories travel. If this story touched your heart and you believe in the power of love, kindness, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like this one. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. Take care, stay kind, and until next time, keep believing in the magic of simple goodness.